All right. I'll just take this time to bring up a few comments, and then they shouldn't take too long because I want to get into the Q&A. First of all, I wanted to thank our presenters for the papers. I felt that they resonated with each other in ways that I want to outline right now, but they've also made me think much critically about not only the conference, but also what brings us in the room today. Since we're videotaped, I could say thank you to the organizers and, of course, Dion for all the work she's done to put this together, and the rest of the Department of African American Studies here at Princeton University. I'm very thankful not only to them, but to everyone in the room right now. This is not my first African American Studies conference. It was 7 years ago that we held our first African American Studies conference at Columbia University. Until this day, I'm filled with kind of excitement and residues of antagonisms with the communities that I made there. And what I see right now is really the making of a future and people just coming together and carrying those links to wherever they go. So thank you for coming here today, and I'm really excited about where we will go together. So my comments will focus on the theme that brings us together. I may not be able to speak to the X that marks intersectionality in the title, but I want to think about how these paper has made me think about intersectionality today. The conference has been thinking about themes of mourning and melancholy. I insert melancholy there precisely to think about proper and improper ways of mourning. We could think about mourning as a relation to the dead, and how that relationship to the dead, in fact, produces different alternative forms of knowledge production, and it makes different political actions possible in the present. This question about the relationship between the past and the present, mourning the dead, could be a good leitmotif to think about intersectionality. I'm very bored with the debates of whether or not intersectionality is outmoded or not. I'm actually much more interested in the ways in which we've inherited intersectionality. And Shai, I think you actually brought this up with your presentation, how intersectionality is now almost coming out of a 30-year career. And for me, I've come to intersectionality as a concept metaphor that was a pedagogical tool. Those who are trained in intersectionality trained me. So what do we do with this concept and idea as we move into different political terrains? And that's what I see what these panelists are doing. They're taking up a concept that they've inherited without choice and applying it in ways that may be aberrant to the very models that they've been given as well. So the question is, how do we inherit intersectionality and where do we take it? So I'll start off with Will's paper. In Sandy Still Can Still Speak Through Her Mother, Will Mosley III mobilizes intersectionality as a historical intervention, asking us to consider the history of women's labors in the United States within a purview of the emergent field of disability studies. So Mosley traces an aesthetic genealogy that moves from the refusal of work that he locates in the caring of a disabled child in an antebellum plantation. And that same refusal of work comes to animate Geneva Reed Vale's radical gesture that disrupts the political spectacle of the DNC. So Mosley writes, the gesture of Reed Vale's hand cuts the tension between black radical politics of the Say Her Name crowd and the post-racial liberals who are probably made uncomfortable by the unscripted cameo appearance of radical black feminists, sonic descent. So what's brilliant about Mosley's interpretation of this gesture is how it comes into view the consideration of a politics of disabilities that prefigures disability studies. So Mosley wants us to enter the purported dead time of black mothers attending to children deemed useless within plantation economy. So here we come to encounter anti-work politics that we might describe as a wayward social reproduction. Insofar as by attending and caring to worthless children, these black mothers are actually attending and pointing to futures where there are none. And I'll also point to the case of Blind Tom, who was a savant piano player who was born into slavery. And what's fascinating about Blind Tom, though, is after emancipation, he was still underneath the jurisdiction of his masters because they made money off of it. So in a sense, the disabled child also created different forms of production. And we could think about how attending to those children can be an anti-work politic in and of itself. Jen M. Jackson's Militancy of Memory posits intersectionality as an analytical horizon, as you say, another project. So you end with the naming this desire to further develop your framework and a singular focus of whiteness as its own analytical dimensions. Other variants of cognizers must be assessed and to understand how ignorance is exhibited through other habituses. Jackson's brilliant reformulation of habitus as a central operation within white ignorance is also an epistemic practice. Here, ignorance is a mode of knowledge production, a generative disavowal that builds worlds. And I also want to intercede here with the cognizant and the epistemological modes. You're not only demonstrating how this disavowal builds worlds, but I'm also interested in the passionate attachment to those worlds. Not so much of this disavowal of knowledge as a knowledge production, but that disavowal as a preserving a particular attachment to oneself, a sense of self. Right? So how might there be a passionate attachment that enables white ignorance to operate as this hegemonic operation? The brilliance of your own intervention is how you think about collective action, and also how struggle itself could be the grounds for world making. I would love for you to talk about that a bit more, especially with the kind of ontological paradox, and I didn't want to use ontology there. Let's say just the paradox of building a world on struggle. Right? What kind of grounds does struggle constitute? And how might we think about those plurality of grounds to actually think not of intersectionality only as an analytical horizon, but as a resource that's already there? When people come together, they bring all that they have as well. Shai Crowder's Through the Black Queer Feminist Lens presents intersectionality as a political ideal. And I have to actually thank you, Shai, for having me think through these questions of generations as well, because you posit it directly in your paper, and I was really surprised on how, well, not surprised, it's just true. So she interrogates the processes of translating an analytical framework into a practice and mode of advocacy, and more particularly, intersectional advocacy. So we have in the 1980s a concept metaphor that is meant to provide analytical clarity around modes of violence and oppression before the law, right? Crenshaw, a lawyer, thinking about policy. Within this context, however, Crowder asks us to think about how is intersectionality mobilized within a political field that is transformed by social networks and social media more generally. One unnamed Italian philosopher comes to mind, and his description of social networks as a publicness without publics. And I feel here that Crowder actually intervenes within this idea when she takes us to Twitter, not only to think about the political speech of BYP 100, pardon me, but instead the retweet. The retweet as a democratic check, a kind of gesture that in and of itself creates a public to that public. So how might we think about retweeting not only as a response, but also as a kind of practice or a form of advocacy that emerges around organizations themselves? And this is particularly pertinent to your not so subtle, but I think very important critique of party politics within this contemporary moment. What does a party look like over and against a coalition that emerges around an idea, right? And last but not least, Ahmad Green Hayes' Queer Caskets and Prisons presents intersectionality as a specter. He asks us to focus on the politics of mourning, and more particularly the distributions of grief and grievability within the purview of the routinized violence and brutality that maintains whiteness as property. Haunted by the intra-communal violence, the multiplicity of violences that are diffused and diffuses racial terror across various vectors, Green Hayes, asks us to attend to the wounded sociality, which we have no map to explore in this contemporary moment. He pushes us to think about the impositions of normative modes of grief and the politics of mourning that finds compensation for loss in the reproduction of normative conditions of subjection. What I wanted to talk a little bit about as well, however, is how in response to these redistribution of griefs, we find public mournings that are emerging from the experience of death. And what I mean by that is how you are mapping out a terrain that you, especially when you're citing this trans method that is working to clarify the present absences of multiple sites of intersections by demanding moments of critical presence. And I do not want to romanticize a suicidal gesture, but within the very context that Piedmont Park is, how might we think about readying oneself into a monument of a world that is yet to come, as well as a form of taking one's own life? That is not meant to romanticize death, but it's more so important to thinking about the uncharted, unmapped, multiple sites of intersections that come into view when one acts upon one's own body. The overarching question I want to ask, and I want to please hear from everyone else, is a question that runs through all my comments, and that is, what is a time of intersectionality? I'm not asking about the historical context, but more so, how does intersectionality today function as a conceptual metaphor that organizes the past, present, and future? When we mobilize intersectionality, are we mobilizing it towards a future horizon that's the same as 1989? Or is intersectionality a way in which we might be able to think about the multiple vectors of oppression across time? And how might we make different claims to futures that have yet to arrive, futures that will never arrive, and griefs and hopes and dreams that we have on our own right now? So in the sense of this conference, I want us to, not only here, but across the board, try to distinguish between the futures that we've inherited and the futures that we need right now. And how intersectionality, precisely in the ways that you have all stretched it, in my opinion, beyond its own reach, you're demonstrating the ways in which we need to reimagine the futures in which intersectionality carries itself as a way of possibly attending to the needy dead. So you could just join up in the front, and I would rather open up the conversation to you all. My question was purposely abstract, and I would rather hear from the participants and from the audience members.
Hi, my name is Brianna. I'm a senior in the sociology department getting a certificate in African American Studies, and I have a question for Shea, but I don't, it's kind of specific about your methodology and the way that you're defining your terms, but I think that it speaks to a broader question in the conversation around intersectionality. And I was wondering, how did you deal with issues that could have been categorized as both like intersectional and, what were the things, consensus issues and cross-cutting? So like you used the example of policing, but like one of the things that I often hear about when people are trying to make intersectional arguments is that policing disproportionately affects trans and queer Black people, and that it still, even though it doesn't disproportionately affect women as much as it disproportionately affects men, it still does affect them in that way. And so like, and you kind of frame it as a consensus issue, but it could also be, I guess, depending on how you swing it, also intersectional. And I also thought on the other side of that, like, how do you deal with issues in which it might seem like someone is getting at more of an intersectional issue when they're really taking it to be a consensus issue? So, for example, you looked at electoral tweets and I saw how the Democratic Party tweeted about voting rights, and in some senses we could see like the gutting of the Voting Rights Act is something that is like against like Black people and minority voters, but you know, I actually learned the most about the gutting of the Voting Rights Act from a white male who I know, and the way that he understands the Voting Rights Act and the way it's being gutted. He's like, they're doing this to suppress Democratic voters. You know, and so he's looking at the way that college students are negatively affected by it, or the way that, you know, white Democratic voters are negatively affected by Republican practices. So like, one person could read a tweet about voting rights as like advocating for African Americans. I don't want to like go on and get my point, but like just wondering how you are defining terms of intersectional and consensus and cross-cutting, and how that speaks to the larger conversation.
So one thing that I did was I double counted things. And so on the Venn diagram that I initially showed, it shows where there's overlap in categories. So if a tweet was policing but also talked about Black trans people, I counted it in both categories. And so glad nobody's that quick with their math. If you would have added up the percentages, they don't add up because there's overlap across categories. And that's a really great point about how the way that you talk about something could be in a consensus way, but also in a cross-cutting way. So the economic tweets are a really good example of that. And I didn't include that in this slide just because I wanted to keep things brief, but if you look at the way that BYP 100 talks about the economy, it is in a very sort of cross-cutting way with attention to like the most marginalized communities, whereas the way that the NAACP talks about the economy are in like really regimented mainstream ways, advocating that you go to Wells Fargo and get this type of loan. And so I think that, I have a slide, you guys will see it. I think that in future iterations of the project, I'll spend more time talking about that, because I also think that it's really important that class analysis doesn't drop out of my work. But for right now, I just decided to focus on just gender and sexuality.
I have I guess more of a broad question that all of you might address, because one of the sort of theoretical underpinnings that all of your papers reminded me of is sort of Mbembe's necropolitics, where he's looking at it very differently, sort of in the vein of like suicide bombing and like. So I guess I'm curious to hear all of you sort of think through how does the politics of martyrdom change kind of the lens that we're thinking of Black death, social death? Just in all of your projects, I think like there's this tension sort of between victim and martyr, and then like how the political valency in the movement takes up certain individuals and doesn't for others, and sort of like how does the figure of a martyr like shift or become incorporated into your work?
Thank you for your question. Immediately as you were speaking, my mind, I'm recalling a line from Layli Laparian, who formerly was known as Layli Phillips, who anthologized The Womanist Reader. But in the second volume, The Womanist Idea, there's a chapter where she reflects on the loss of her daughter. And her daughter died by way of suicide. And it's interesting because she retrospectively goes back and tries to chart spiritual moments, prophetic insights where her daughter was communicating that she was about to take flight. And she's not, going back to Nijah's usage of the word romanticizing, she's not romanticizing suicide, but she is calling for the reclamation of a Black subjectivity that is inherently in the hands of Black people, right? And by extension is making the argument that notions of flight, wherever means they come, are invocations of a womanist idea. And I don't necessarily see people who take their lives as martyrs, even though that could be the ways to death or the moment of flight is being politicized. So for Michael Smith in Piedmont Park, I don't see him, or maybe he is a martyr, I don't know. I think that's up for discussion. What I see Michael doing in that moment is taking back something that was stripped from him. And perhaps we're very uncomfortable with talking about suicide or notions of like auto-genocide, right? Because or in some ways it actually counteracts Black radical political ideologies, right? So what does it mean to reclaim a genealogy of Black suicide, which we have seen before colonization? What does it mean to think about those who jump ship? Tony K. Bambara talks a great deal about how we have no memorial or no means of commemorating those whose bones are in the Bruni Deep, right? And Christina Sharp's work is getting to that, but I think even with wake work, there is an emphasis on those who were thrown overboard rather than those who jumped ship. And then I think Toni Morrison's work, there's also the thread of that, in terms of with Sula, thinking about her allusions to Evo's Landing, Daughters of the Dust, you see it, and Being Mary Jane, we see it, right? And I think there are, I want you to but there are, traces of this thought, and some could say that Corinne Gaines, right, was suicidal. Right. What is it? And that is inherently attached to the politics of respectability, which says you are doing X, Y, Z, and this is why you have caused death to come upon you. But what does it mean for Corinne Gaines to talk back to the state and not care about death? And I think in many ways, and this is a theological question for me too. Notions of salvation have been turned into the purification of one's soul, but in many ways, when you go to the root of what salvation means in the Greek, it really means to lose fear of dying, right? So like, how do we reclaim a fear of not dying? And I think we have gotten comfortable in the realm of academia because of class and all of this stuff where we've forgotten that as the revolutionary politica of our black or brown or what have you political roots. So yeah, I don't know. I'm still, thinking about this question, and it's a serious question because number one, we're in this moment where we're now starting to deal with mental illness and those things, and suicide automatically gets put under the umbrella of mental illness. And I think people are scared to think about what if it's not always mental illness.
Also, to tack on to that point, I think when we talk about martyrdom, I think the term martyrdom operates differently for a black body. I'm thinking about, Alexis Blaine Gumbs' work on black motherhood as being inherently queer because black bodies are not meant to survive. And I think what's interesting is like even the language around dying by suicide, especially in terms of black life. And even the panel we had earlier today, when you think about slow death and long-term violence, I theorize, and people should raise their eyebrows at me, but I theorize that black death in this country it should all be seen as a neoliberal crisis, not just an emergency, not just because of Hurricane Katrina or a heat wave or some other type of like spectacular event, but black death in a post-colonial imperialistic country should always be seen as a condition of the state, right? It is inherently linked to the conditions in the long-term afterlife of the colonial state. And so I would argue that, martyrdom is always limited, and I think that linguistically these words always take on different meaning. You put black in front of them, right? You say motherhood, and one thing pops in your head. I say black motherhood, and you think something completely different. And I think the same thing works for death. I think the same thing works for martyrdom. And so I think that in terms of your question, I think it's an important question, and I appreciate that you brought in Mbembe's work because that was exactly why he did necropolitics, because he's thinking about Foucault's idea of biopolitics and how the state operates to decide who lives and who gets to live and who dies. But I think that, to Ahmad's point, I think that there are more questions that have to be asked about how suicide operates in a community that is inheriting the condition of slavery. Right, inheriting the condition of post-slavery, of Jim Crow, of segregation, of legal violence, of extrajudicial murder. So the term for me, suicide, takes on a completely different meaning when we're thinking about, the panel earlier talking about lead poisoning and how there are communities across this country thinking about Flint, right? People who can't even drink water, right? So if you've been without water for 4 years and you're sick, and you've already been becoming even sicker because of conditions of environmental racism, and then you decide, I can no longer do this. So the suicide has the same meaning in that case. You see what I'm saying? So I think for me, it's like, it just requires further theorization. There's more questions to be asked because these terms don't transfer across social groups in the ways that people sometimes like them to.
Yeah, I think also what comes to mind is like it's a question of representation, and the narrative of the martyr often is not in the hands of the martyr themselves. And I'm really thinking about Beatrice Vivek's Can the Subaltern Speak, and that iconic moment where a woman is like commits suicide and leaves like a bloody rag next to her to show that she was not committing suicide because of an extramarital affair in which she was pregnant, which was kind of like the go-to narrative of one finds a woman in that situation. And ultimately she finds that the subaltern, but I prefer to think about what Dwight McBride does with that, what Can the Queen Speak, what Murray Miller Young does with that, and Can the Host Speak, and really like take a moment to see where, instead of like passing the mic over to see can you talk, as opposed to really just seeing what their narrative is on their own terms. And martyrdom has this a question of ethics to me that feels uncomfortable. That I don't touch in my work because it's a little dissociating and anti-black in a lot of ways that you were just mentioning. So yeah.
I guess since everyone took the, I was gonna skip it, but so to answer like the second part of your question, I am interested in exploring which Black bodies mobilize people, and I think that I can do that through my analysis here. So one thing that I coded for that I didn't show is when you're talking about a certain topic, when you're talking about economic justice, when you're talking about women, when you're talking about LGBTQ issues, is there an action associated with what the tweet is? So some language in some tweets is action oriented and some are not. And so I think that if I explore when there's a call to action and when there's not, that could be a way of getting at an exploration of what Black bodies mobilize people in.
And just add one thing, I think it's really important that necropolitics is a question about sovereignty, and it's an expression of sovereignty that mobilizes life and death in order to legitimate itself. And I think that's something, I don't want to talk about anti or non-sovereign, but this question about legitimate uses of force, who has a monopoly of violence in a particular moment in time, might help us get outside of the moral conundrum of is suicide good or bad, but how life and death are distributed or even organized within a particular here and now. So I think it's a really great question that I think all of you are responding to, and I took more time. Someone had hands up? Yeah.
I really appreciated you guys' presentations, in part because it like really encouraged me to like revisit a question that I can maybe kind of like written off. Claudia Rankine famously says that like the move for Black Lives like realizes like the condition of Blackness is like one of the mourning, and like brings that to the fore. And the way that we saw that originally was with like the hands up no shoot thing, or like the I can't breathe or whatever, which like I had like kind of like performing critiques of. But like maybe like I was thinking when you were talking about BYP 100, I was and then after your Mourning thing, I mean all of y'all had like reasons that like drove me back here. But I was thinking about an action that the BYP 100 chapter in DC did some time ago, where they like showed up to like a fraternal order of police and like togas that were like stained like blood red or whatever, with like blood-filled coffins or whatever. And like I'm thinking about the things that people in Chicago have done with like coffins and like really like OD kind of shit or whatever, to like bring like back the fact that like police is the most dangerous thing. And so I was just thinking about how maybe something to like I'm curious about like how that kind of grounding that like not births, but like the kind of grounding from which like this movement has taken place is one that like kind of tries to like centralize or at least bring forth that like death and like mourning has to be happening for Black people at all times or whatever, like how that intercommunally, I guess, kind of like organizes our actions or whatever. So like thinking about your like Twitter things, I was like just like curious about like how because you know there's always an uptick in like activism and things or whatever like after the death of someone, and so there's just like a certain way that like mourning and like grief are both engaged into like very like tactical and like strategic ends or whatever. But I'm also curious about like how, I don't know, just like the like free floating signifier of like an open condition of mourning and kind of like structures like how like coalition is able to be built, what kind of performances comes out of you know these things or whatever, and like the like collective or communal processes of grief that would come to us as well. So I don't know if you just want to talk about that at all.
Well, yeah, so for me, all of the tweets, all of my data is timestamped. So I think that would be actually really interesting to trace the relationship between deaths and tweets and actions. But based on my analysis of the tweets, I actually think surprisingly enough, at the organizational level, we really might not see much. I think that the patterns will be clearer when you look at like the mass public and the way that people who aren't constantly attuned to these issues are talking about them, because BYP 100 is tweeting about this sort of stuff all the time, every single day. It really doesn't stop. And a lot of the stuff going on their Twitter account is reflected, you know, and they're talking about past deaths, you know, and not just what's happening that day. And so I think that at the organizational level, we might not see much. But then if I were to look at the retweets of those tweets, they might have a higher volume following a death.
In the interest of time, I wanted to get some other questions as well, but if you have an answer to this question, you may want to weave it into your answer to the next question as well. So I had a few hands back.
I actually wanted to repose Nijah's question in many ways. And I wanted to ask about doing intersectional work now in this moment where there seems to be this sort of popular circulation of the term intersectionality, and yet as some of your work sort of demonstrates, there's a slippage between that popular circulation and the actual practice of doing politics, wherein there's a sort of differential response to different types of Black bodies being killed. And I wonder what you all thought of that, or what we should make of that. So that sort of discrepancy between the sort of idea that every university you go to, different organizations claim to be doing intersectional work. The movement for Black Lives is accredited to, its origin is accredited to Black queer women, and yet the death of Black queer women doesn't motivate mass mobilization. What is that?
You want to add up?
Yeah, just want to add on to that. Like, and I also just kind of building on that, I wanted to know if you guys could speak to just your experience of like, I don't know, just being your intersectional selves and doing the work that you do in your various departments, because I know that you guys are not, as far as I know, for the most part, in primarily African American studies. Like I know you're in political science, I know you're in your politics, religion. So I also just, because this work is so important, I just wanted to know if you guys could share about like, I don't know, just like what that's like, or what strategies you undertake to kind of be intersectional, not just like write about it. You know what I mean? Like, and I don't know. You know what I mean?
Well, I do want to respond directly to Marcus and Nijah's kind of call, like what do we do? Like, what is this work looking like? And I think the other path of intersectional work is to kind of problematize what work is and like what labor does. So part of my project is to honor and really value gendered forms of Black labor, Black women doing particular kinds of work that don't get the kind of credit that they should, and the amount of labor that it took for Geneva Reed Beale to do that, and being able to speak not only to Black radical feminism, but to like white liberal audience at the same time as she's mourning. So like we don't really have a language yet developed to kind of deal with that, and so part of the labor involved in what I see doing, and I'm coming from a African and African diaspora studies department where all of my professors are Black queer, Black trans, and predominantly women. So like this is always a problem for me, and it's a good productive problem. It's good to kind of be, you know, in the mess or in the wake, you know, just kind of sit in that, as so many other panelists have talked about.
I just had a direct kind of response. I might push back a little bit because I do wonder about the function of those mothers' stories and testimonies and their words on that stage. Especially because of what we know of the Democratic National Convention, and the ways in which Black suffering actually gets corporatized for liberal interests. And I also say that knowing that Black women like Miss Geneva walk in a particular kind of agency and have the ability to make political decisions on their own, and that she's very much intellectually and politically informed, right? But at the same time, I think there is too much trust in a system, in Hillary Clinton, right, and in the Democratic Party that has actually done more harm than good. And I see this in parallel and in conversation with the ways that Black people have been trained in many ways to rush to forgiveness as soon as we're murdered, and there is no time to grieve or to mourn or to be angry. And I think we also have to name that their being on the stage happens at the end of an Obama presidency. And this is where I think Kathy Cohen's work is very much influential here with Democracy Remix, and thinking about the ways in which Obama and Barack Obama and Michelle Obama become the matriarch and the patriarch of the American nation state. And what does it mean for America to have a Black maternal figure, a Black mother, a mammy, if you will, right, who can actually politically assuage the interests of white liberals at any turn, even as they demonize her, say she is not feminine enough, totally strip her physicality in ways that they did not do Barbara Bush, right? And that's all happening simultaneously. And we can't forget, and I don't mean to exaggerate, I've been thinking about this, and what does it mean for Michelle Obama to talk about living in a house that was built by slaves, and to find rest in that. That's something we should be happy about. So there are just a number of things, and I think it's that exact political issue or the assemblage that actually gets to what Marcus is raising. We actually can't have an embodied intersectional politics because we are too interested in getting to the table and being inside of the White House and being in academic regalia, and that requires, it actually necessitates that particular peoples and bodies are left out. So if you're too queer, if you're trans, if you're this, if you're that. So, and this is the other illusion of this moment. We say that Black Lives Matter in this moment, this political moment, is not as homophobic or transphobic as past movements, but I actually think people have learned how to be homophobic in secret, transphobic in secret. As long as you don't tweet it or post it on Facebook or say it in class, and you can do the political dance of nice, you're good. But deep down inside, there's no embodied political practice, which tells me that we don't actually believe what intersectionality is saying. And I'm always weary when white folks in particular are running with this term, and it actually loses its radicality because it's so I don't know. I'm just kind of rambling at this point, but it's just a frustration for me, and it also, I'm appreciative of Kimberly Crenshaw's work, but I'm very I'm terrified at how we just slap intersectionality on whatever you want, and people can still die, but you can say you're intersectional. That disturbs me.
So, yes.
Sorry.
No, you're right. And so it's interesting. So as you were talking, I'm thinking about to answer both questions actually. Joy James's work on radicalizing feminism and what that looks like. This idea gets on small. But thinking about the mainstreamizing of feminism, and I think that's kind of what you're getting at, right? So, even as folks, Katy Perry said misogynoir last year, and everyone was like, "Oh my gosh, what is misogynoir?" Why? Because Katy Perry said it. And that's the reason why I did this project, because in a lot of ways, the public articulation of intersectionality and the public articulation of Blackness involves so much of the contorting and the like gesticulation at the altar of whiteness, and figuring out ways that to be recognized. And so I mean, I think there's multiple tiers here. We're talking about, and this is one of those things where like, so I'm gonna answer both questions, but I'm thinking about the ways like going into grad school as a radical Black queer feminist and having people tell me, don't tell anyone. Or you do math, right? Okay, at least you can do that. Or just write a lot about Barack Obama. Like, that'll get you tenure, right? And so, thinking about
Trying to be serious about it.
And so, but thinking about even the way that when we, work to make intersectional spaces, how they are conditioned upon these kind of inherently anti-Black, transphobic, homophobic, sexist, misogynistic kind of understandings of what that space should even be fashioned to do, right? And so I think to answer both questions, what we're coming up against is this kind of commercialization, this kind of neoliberal crisis, right? Everything's neoliberal. And the way that even our radicalism is commodified, even our devs are commodified. Pepsi commercials are now making, trying to do the Black Lives Matter thing with Kendall Jenner. And you know what I'm saying? So thinking about just saying, it happened. So just thinking about so for me, it's a question of like both top down, bottom up, and intra-group, right? It's how much are we willing, to give away, right? How much are we willing to compromise for recognition? How much of ourselves are we willing to contort and break and bend and kill? And how many fingers will we lose? How many arms? This quotidian, like I call this the quotidian, this is a slow death. This is a quotidian everyday death that we, as we step our toes onto campuses like these, as I walk onto University of Chicago, as I'm sitting in my car in the morning and holding back tears so I can go TA these white students who will look at me like I don't belong there, right? So how much of that are we willing and able to withstand so that we can at some point, and I don't know what that point is. I don't know if this is a futurity conversation, but how much of that can we endure in order to do the work of intersectional academics and scholarship? And that panel before this was really, really lit, y'all. I hope y'all saw it. But is it Derica? Is that her name? Yeah. She was talking about how these universities are oppressed. So like at Chicago, there was this language around, oh, you all have to be the critical mass. You all have to do it. We brought all these students of color in now. You all do the work. And I said, while sitting next to Barbara Ransby, so it probably wasn't a good idea. But I was like, why are you gonna bring more cars to the car accident? It's a car accident. Why are we inviting more cars? Like, shouldn't we clear the cars that had the accident and then bring more? And everyone was like, oh my gosh, you can't say that. And I'm like, but that's what it is, right? And so I'm sorry. I ain't got no clues, I ain't got no behavior. But I mean, I'm thinking about that in terms of the way that we move throughout these universities. Why would you say, hey, we need more scholars of color, we need more scholars who represent us, and you bring in people with terrible politics? It doesn't make any sense, but this is why. This is the top-down nature of a white supremacist hegemonic institution. The institution is always going to support itself, right? University of Chicago said, we don't like trigger warnings, and we don't like safe spaces. And the donors said, yes, we got millions of dollars, right? There is a reason for this. And so I feel like I'm not answering the question. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that, we are constantly contending with these conditions, right? It's beautiful to be in a space like this. It's beautiful. I was talking to Ahmad and Will about this earlier, but thinking about the ways that we have folks who are going into universities who look like this, and how that warms my heart, but at the same time, I do feel melancholy. I'm like, oh, I feel bad for us. I feel bad for y'all who haven't started. I'm sorry, you started next year. But like, you go to Berkeley, you should be okay, a little bit okay.
Wait, where?
Berkeley, right? You go to Berkeley?
I thought you said Princeton.
Oh, exactly. So I guess the answer to the question is it's a constant tension. We're on camera too. Not good. But you know, it's constant. It's a constant tension. It's a constant tension, and so I've never liked black or white. It's all gray. There's a lot of nuance, and it shifts and it changes, and we're constantly compromising and we're constantly negotiating in these spaces. And so I think that intersectionality is one. The work of intersectionality is the work of negotiation, is the work of finding oneself and reorienting oneself at all times and trying to be the best version of one's black, queer, radical, trans, whatever it may be, self in that moment. And it's always going to be it's going to be a struggle. And I think that's something that we find ourselves coming up against every day.
Yeah, I mean, to speak to your question and also off Jen's point, I'm sitting here right now with so much anxiety because I was late to this panel because I couldn't get out of something. And now because I was late, the panel's probably running longer. And today they're having the Women in Political Science dinner and we don't get anything. So I feel like I really have to be at that. And I'm in politics and in AFAM and nobody else is because nobody else is interested in that. And so everyone else I'm sure is right on time. And then it just kind of like recapitulates like, oh, well, what if she? Why is she not invested in politics? She doesn't want to come to departmental events. And it's like, because I think James Baldwin put it best, that I have to know everything about you all, and you don't have to know anything about me.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think that, we're always kind of trying to navigate that.
All right, yeah. we could yeah, we could continue the conversation afterwards. Just 2 notes. There is something called Final Cut Pro, my man. You could. Premiere. Oh, Premiere. That's that other one, They could like make us do things that we don't even know. And secondly, thank you for just really making these spaces. This is a delightful conversation, and you've inspired me to think deeper. All right, take care.